legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is James Tunney, who joins us for the latest in an ongoing series of dialogues exposing the assault on humanity by the emerging global technocratic dictatorship. In the early 21st century, there is a war against humanity. Non-material forces and ultra-dimensional entities appear to be involved. They deny the existence of powers beyond 5-sense three-dimensional reality, while simultaneously using them against us. Ultimately, this is a spiritual battle, and their agenda is profoundly anti-human. Who are they? What do they want? And why do we surrender? Hello and welcome, James, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
I'm looking forward to the conversation, Greg.
Today, James, we're doing part two of a recent conversation that we started, and that was inspired by your new book, Plantation of the Automaton's Rule of an Automaticity Loop. Now, I'm going to dispense with the personal introduction on this one because every previous interview that we've done together, and there have been a few, you've set out a potted bio. I recommend in any event that listeners check out part one of this interview, ideally before they come to this part, so they can find out all about your background and your work very easily if they want to, and there's links in any event on this interview page to your website. So what we're going to be doing today, last time we explored many themes that we have in previous conversations about what we're facing as a species in terms of advances and changes in mainly in technology, but they're affecting every dimension of our lives: social life, political life, economic, pretty much everything that you can think of. And the last few years have been really a living, how can I put it, lesson in how this can be ramped up very, very easily. And although things have sort of feel like they're a little bit more relaxed now, the pandemic phase and the response to it saw great advances in the agendas that you and I have discussed, and you've written extensively about, that of technocracy, of scientism, transhumanism as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about the non-material dimensions of what we're facing, because I think really that's where the crux of it lies ultimately. Because you can talk all day, we can talk all day about command and control systems and surveillance matrix, 24/7, digital currencies, social credit systems, all these other things that can be used to corral us into, the human zoo and monitor our lives, restrict our lives in whatever way is deemed appropriate or suitable by those whose agenda this is. But behind that, there's something which I think really holds the key to it all. How to kick this off, I'm not quite sure. Simply, one thought that occurred to me, has occurred to me time and time again, not just in recent years with what we've been through, but prior to this, when thinking about these technocratic and transhumanist agendas, is that increasingly as the 20th century came to an end and we moved into the 21st, those of us in secular Western industrial civilizations were repeatedly being told that there was no meaning, no purpose to existence, to life. Religion was fading away, no traditional religion, any sort of observance along those lines. If there was any sort of spirituality, it was of the New Age variety. But people were increasingly seeking meaning and purpose in materialism, both senses of the word, as a way of life, acquisitive, and as a cosmology that, matter is all that matters. There's only 5 senses, 3 dimensions. That is it. So we're being denied this non-material dimension of our very existence, of reality, of the cosmos, of nature. But it seemed to me that whatever forces were seeking to control and exploit us were taking advantage of non-material dimensions of reality in whatever way. So maybe you could just address that central idea. It's saying nothing to see here. There is nothing behind the curtain. There are no forces that cannot be measured and explained by science. But by the way, we're using these very things against you.
Well, yes, there's been, methinks they do protest too much about spirit. And when you dig a bit deeper, it's difficult to find a rejection of spirit in some of the people that want to control us. It's really a rejection of a certain type of light spirit that is desired by them. So there is a strange fascination in certain quarters with technology and with magic. And behind that, and there's a question of degree, of course, or of our knowledge as well, there is a sense that there is a dark force. And of course, if you start any argument with talking about dark forces, you can easily be labeled as some kind of crank, and it's easy to ridicule the argument. But there are various people. One of the people that Jeff was familiar with was Wilson von Dusen, for example, who believed that a lot of schizophrenia was actually spirit possession, and he treated it accordingly. And there's another chap at the moment in America working on that same premise. So it is quite incredible that the more mind doctors we seem to have a proportionally more associatedly more mental disease. So all these doctors are not really contributing towards the diminishment of mental disease. And there is a strong sense that mental disease is associated with a spiritual problem, that there is a spiritual dimension to it. And I trace this back to the change associated with Thomas Huxley, where they began to make a deliberate move in imperial science, not just to banish religion, but to take spirit out of any discourse that was in any way scientific. And that's, in fact, the origin of psychical research as a reaction against that movement within imperial science. And in that context, spiritualism in Britain in particular is associated, really, you could trace it back to, or some elements, some streams, back to Blake. And Swedenborg was a big player in igniting a certain wave of belief or a reinterpretation of the spirit world. And he was very, very clear about light and darkness and about spiritual light. And my views accord with him in this context, independently of that, before I began to look in more detail at his views. That and this accords also with the Gnostic approach and the Gospel of Thomas, and even the canonical Gospels, that we are light beings, that our nature is light, and that a lot of spiritual experience is about us encountering the light to which we recognize, a spiritual light which is different from natural light. And Swedenborg makes this point in Heaven and Hell when he's talking about the nature of heaven and hell. He says that natural light is a cold light, and spiritual light is a warm light. And I would describe it as affective light. So in a lot of non-normal experience or extraordinary experience or spiritual experience or mystical experience, there's an experience of light. And the sense of light is that it's noetic, it's informative, it's a living force, and we are part of that. And that if you look at the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel, or the non-canonical text, he says, Jesus says that if they ask you where you come from, say you came from the place where light came into being of its own accord. So there was a deeper connection with light, and in contrast to that, we have obviously the idea of darkness, and of course this is found in all the traditions, in the Persian traditions. And Swedenborg was saying that he made an interesting. He's one of the only writers that claims to have been in hell and seen hell, and he said that in hell, people don't look any different than they did normally. But if you're a spiritual being, you will see their ugliness. So it's about the spiritual eyes and spiritual light. The classes, if you look at the elite classes, and if you look at secret societies, you'll see certain motifs that come up again and again. The skull is a classic one. An awful lot of the secret societies in the United States use the skull. There are certain motifs that come up, and they're associated with that from what we read or what information we can glean that's reliable. We do have a belief in a force which is a non-human force. Now, again, I tend to be a bit careful about being very specific about that force, but it's a force which is in every religion, whether you come from an Islamic background or a Christian background or a non-religious background. People are aware that there are beings which can possess the individual, and I've talked about the good people, as they call. I'm not going to be talking loud about the fairies too much. Bring bad luck. But these beings, in my view, also refer to beings that can move into human consciousness and can possess us. So I don't have any problem in accepting that we are subject to forces which are beyond the material, naturalistic regime. And I don't have any problem at all in believing that certain groups or utilize access to different domains, and often this is in, so people are clear about it. I've located my critique on an Atlanticist basis, meaning the Anglosphere, and the occult basis in the Anglosphere is very, very strong. And you can see it in a whole range, in a vast interest in a whole range of people who are associated with the occult. And I'm not saying everyone associated with the cult is a dark or is inherently dark, but certain figures are. And you see certain crossovers, for example, with the deep state, with the intelligence systems, the idea of intelligence, the idea of certain secretive operations. There is a crossover, and there's often a strong link between people involved in magic and people involved in deep state activities. So the denial of that connection is hard to maintain. They are certainly interested in some of these forces in the existence of this reality. And when we're talking about the movement towards a mechanical plant system where the human is assimilated through a process of endosymbiosis into an international metallic network, iron and silicon and nickel, the solid state entity, there is a sense that there is a creation of the greater Leviathan, and that was the supposedly positive name that Hobbes talks about in relation to the state, this greater force. And of course, James Lovelock has talked about in the Novocene about us becoming plants towards this system. So whether you come at it from a scientific perspective or whether you come at it from a cult perspective, there is this idea that we are giving up or yielding what existed before as our individual sovereign and eternal soul, and we're pooling it in some way into a mechanical system. And there's no doubt that idea of sorcery is very, very deep in relation to high technology. It's there, it's mentioned, it's conceded by and advertised, in fact, by people like Arthur C. Clarke, who talked about the indistinguishability of magic and high technology, as we know. So there's no doubt that there is a perception of a different force, and it's of course, we can read in all the texts or significant texts, Manly Hall, etc., the idea, a long-held idea that one could succumb to a higher force and gain from access to the spirit world. That's what a lot of conjuring is about in its true sense. It's gaining the power over spirits to do the will that on this material plane for a temporary period.
Just a very quick note of housekeeping. Towards the top of your comments there, you mentioned Jeff. Were you referring to Jeffrey Mishlove?
Sorry, Jeffrey Mishlove, I apologize.
No, that's okay. Just because we talked about him off air. So this is Jeffrey Mishlove of Thinking Aloud and New Thinking Aloud fame, just if people wanted to.
Good point,
to cross-reference that. Well, yeah, you also alluded to the fact about, in terms of experience of light, different qualities of light, different properties, different fundamental types, about the anomalous experiences, so-called, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and those who have these experiences, how they report, whether it's moving towards the light, moving through the light, becoming one with the light, realizing that they are fundamentally lights, and that all is has that quality to it. So there's that idea, which is well established in the the accounts, whether first person, second, or however they're recounted. And there's also the very interesting effects of different types of light, whether it be sunlight, reflected sunlight as moonlight, all the forms of artificial light, electrical light that our technology has generated, compared to, for example, the light from a fire, which is the first type of light that we really ever had, apart from the light from the sky, as it were. So there's a lot to play with in all of that. And the potential detrimental effects of artificial light are well documented, but also ways to counter that with, not just with an absence of light, but with the right type of light, as it were, is also, part of the modalities for kind of ameliorating some of these, deleterious technological effects that are doing so much harm to us in the modern environment.
Yes, and part of this process, part of the tyranny that's emerging is an effort to drive us indoors, away from nature and away from light. And as I've explained before, I believe that is literally to turn us into part of the electronic plant through implants. And there is some deep relationship between light, as well as natural light, and spiritual light. Now, there is an interesting connection as well. I'm also writing about crystals, and crystals are very, very important in all this game. They're a major element, and in fact, there are recent books which explain that how significant crystals were in the Second World War, for example. Crystals are of critical importance in a lot of high technology, but they're also of critical importance in all ancient magical practices. You will find that crystals come up again and again and again. And again, there's a relationship between crystals and changing state. This is a key idea in relation to, say, whether it's the World Economic Forum, etc. So they're changing the nation state into the state of the world, and they're trying to change the human state. And they changed human state. They will change human state through materials which themselves change state in accordance with external signals. So there's a very interesting connection between light and crystals. Now, I think spiritual light and consciousness is the same thing. I think spiritual consciousness, which is the wider term I use for consciousness, is effectively light, and that's where the light beings come from. But there is a increasing consciousness of the link between, say, for example, the pineal gland and crystals. Now, that was known about for a long period of time, but if you look at the crystals they're looking at now, on a very small scale in the pineal gland in recent studies, they're looking at things like calcite crystals, which are also very, very important in other technologies that they're using on the brain-computer interface. And these crystals are also very important in biomineralization in plants, because we know that plants they're in a relationship with light, and phototropins in plants help them turn towards the sun, etc. And they operate in accordance with reactions in crystalline form. So crystals are important in relation to being able to change the state of matter and to change state, whether it was and it's probable that the Vikings used crystals in their navigation. So the sunstone, for example, was which scientists believe now that the Vikings used was a crystal, and I think a calcite. So there's a direct link. If we take this idea of light, my argument in relation to what I've written about light is that there is a struggle between the scientific. Now, ultimately, it could be reconciled, and that's the hope. But there's a race between the efforts to understand the fundamental nature of light as a natural force and the spiritual idea of light. And the ones that drive the industrial and corporate and military industrial complex that are working so hard to understand light are in a race, if you like, to gain the power, the kind of magical power that will give, and will displace the inherent spiritual light idea, and will replace it. And in that story, there are certain issues, certain context, certain substances, certain inquiries that give us a clue. And I think crystals is the key idea. And the last point on that, you mentioned the Zeitgeist series, and you reminded me about that. I had seen it, but sometimes I find there's certain themes or contexts that help me in relation to these issues, or are curiously prescient in some sense. And of course, The Simpsons is one of those. And The Simpsons, if you remember the episode or the film, I think, with the glass dome over Springfield, I always thought that was a significant one because it accords with some of the predictions. And in that film, the Moe says to the apparition of Russ Cargill, who used to be in the Environmental Protection Agency, he says, "Oh no, don't tell me we're going to be trapped in like rats." And the projection from the former head of the Environmental Protection Association says, "No, rats are hard to trap. It's more like carrots." And I was wondering why that is, but it accords with, again, the idea of expressed in the book, that there's a long idea of the human as a plant. And there you get the Crystal Palace, you get the shopping malls, and you get the idea of the glass dome. And interestingly, the idea or liquid crystals was found in the 1880s, was discovered when they were investigating cholesterol in carrots. So there is a direct connection. So liquid crystals are most likely the type of approach they're going to use in relation to brain-computer interface. So I'm more skeptical about this idea, drilling a hole in the head and all. Who's going to buy that? You know, some people will, some people have done that, but as a mass technique, it's not really the one that they're going to apply. So liquid crystals are a critical approach, and they're fundamentally, they came from the study of plants. So what I'm suggesting in this recent work is that if we begin to think in terms of how these people think, why they're looking at these issues, why it's so important to have these models, and where those models lead to, we're in a better position to understand the exact nature of their perception of things like light. And there's no question that natural light is critical to us, as is spiritual light. And if our would-be tyrants can control our relationship with light, well, then they can interfere with our spiritual experience, because it's predicated on us living in some natural relationship with the natural world. Once we break that connection, once that connection is broken, it's much easier to control us.
Well, I remember clearly just thinking about the comment in the Simpsons movie about carrots as a child, sort of overhearing, listening to a conversation between the adults talking about someone that they knew. And I don't know if this person had had an accident or a stroke or whatever it was, but something terrible had happened and they'd suffered brain damage. And they were, wheelchair bound and incapacitated. And one of the adults said to the other, "He's just a cabbage now." And this really, really troubled me. And
yes.
I resolved it myself eventually by just, looking into it. But my young mind was convinced that this meant that he'd literally transformed into a vegetable.
Yes.
Literally his mind, what was inside his skull was now, literally a cabbage. And it was really, really, I don't know why it was so disturbing. Maybe it was just because it was so horrific and bizarre. But I took that at face value.
As I said, it goes back to Aristotle and Plato and the idea of the vegetative soul. It's a deeply embedded idea, and of course, it's misused in popular parlance. But the idea has been there, and that idea is also there in the minds of our controllers, that we will be reduced to something which doesn't have that free will or doesn't have the ability to transcend a fixed and planted state. So there is a deeper and long-held tradition associated with that description. And of course, people are a bit more enlightened now about talking about people in general, but it doesn't mean that our would-be bosses don't think in similar terms.
One of the things that was most striking, relevant to all this, which came to the fore during the pandemic period and the response to it, was that here we had this early 21st century Western industrial, secular, scientific society, with no need of any of that mumbo jumbo from any of the holy books or spiritual traditions of the past. Both types of materialism, as mentioned earlier, reigning supreme, giving us everything we wanted on a physical, psychological, and emotional level. And yet, what happened during the whole C-19 thing, where there's this sudden upsurge in what can only be described as religious behavior? Not to do down anybody on a spiritual path, but I'm talking now about that, the not engaged form of religious behavior, the slavish following of diktats and dogma. But for me, that betrayed a real, albeit unfocused and unrealized and unacknowledged desire for that type of engagement, that type of dimension to existence. And people latched on to the ritualistic behavior that dominated so much of that period and pursued it, often in the face of logical evidence to the contrary. And again, I'm not one for logic that is be all and end all. It's just one way of pursuing knowledge, has its limits. But that was really, really striking, I thought. So, and to me, it was like an acknowledgement that this rise in religiosity would be something that would somehow be a feature of the future, that was somehow simultaneously being deindustrialized, but also seeing a ramping up in technological and scientific control, that there would be a dimension of this that would be religious or pseudo-religious. It would speak to that kind of yearning within us, or attempt to, it would try and placate that, to give us a placebo, to give us something in the place of the real quest for the transcendent that is really, I think, what this existence seems to be about.
Yes. My argument has been that what will happen in this, in the empire of scientism, is that we will have effectively a church of science, and that will emerge. But obviously, the scientists become a type of, and the technocrats become a priestly class. And this is exactly what Manly Hall warned about in relation to the disintegration of Egypt and the movement towards kind of black magic. And you could find it also in some of the descriptions of Atlantis, of course. So this seems to be some inherent danger associated with the access to power, and power is when power is concentrated. It's behind a lot of stories about misuse of power. It's behind the fears of some of the cyberneticians when they began to understand what the game was. So there is no doubt that all the religious traditions will be replaced. There is some habit which is associated with ritual and dogma. The only thing I would say is that it's fashionable to criticize dogma, and it depends on what one is talking about. If we look at the perennial philosophy, underneath it all, there are, in all the traditions, there are some sense of not committing to anything lesser than the highest consciousness or the highest force, for example, not having idols before it, or for some people that would be worshipping God or the most or the greatest force in the universe, and in relation to our social behavior in most of the traditions, you're not meant to kill someone, and you're not meant to tell lies, and a few other things. I mean, the essential dogma is not huge, or love God and love your neighbor in Christian terms. So it's been fashionable for scientists to say, oh yeah, well, we can do spiritual experience without the dogma. But once you take out the core principles that, say, C.S. Lewis talked about as the basis, or the Tao, he defined in terms of the Tao, and he was talking about across all the traditions. He said, once you take that out, well, then you can't really go anywhere. You have to resort to the magical view. You have to resort to, and if you look at Harari, when Harari is talking about there's no God in the clouds, there's no religion, there's no spirit, there's nothing under there inside, but he talks about the gods returning, and the gods, of course, will be him and his friends, and the gods will be like the Greek gods. They will have power over life and death, and they will be capricious. They won't be like the god who or concept that evolved. So when for a long time people have warned that the West is becoming post-Christian, and people say, "Oh, that's great. We're secular and we're scientific," but you have to pay the consequences. We haven't had a bill yet for that recent health crisis you were talking about, and we haven't had the bill for a lot of other things. We haven't had the bill for rejecting, in the West, say, a commitment towards some of the values of human dignity that emerged from the Greco-Roman, Judean, Christian culture. And we have experience of what happens when you replace it. We have with the Bolsheviks, with the Nazis, with the shift, as Jung saw, to Wotan. When we talk about the positive side of paganism, we also have to talk about the negative side of it. The point being that when you have said, okay, well, we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater, whatever it is, we can't be surprised when we see, like in Canada, the death cult that's emerging in euthanasia. We see that, and this is all across Europe. In Belgium, I can see it happening in relation in Ireland, where this pervasive death cult will emerge. When you begin to appeal to your notions of human dignity, and you appeal to rights, etc., one has to accept that a lot of people have been very good at casting them out, because the objective in making us reject some of the traditions has been to take out the foundation on which we rely on. A lot of rights were gained by groups in society who were struggling against force. So law and rights happened, often informed in Europe by a Christian tradition, despite how fashionable it is to reject that. And it was from there that certain rights evolved. If you take the Magna Carta in Britain, the effort to put limits on the power of the king And royalty, for example, was an important context in which to articulate rights which were pre-existing and to develop rights like the right to trial by jury, etc. So when we are all trained to say, well, that religion is a waste of time, and look at that terrible Catholic Church, and look at the Protestants and the Protestants, Catholics killing each other, and look at all the damage they've done, etc., etc. Part of the process is to create the blank slate, because we know that from what H.G. Wells has talked about and Bernal has talked about in the 1920s, where they realized they had to abolish the family, the nation state, and religion.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com